Hello, and welcome to our first installment of Terrier Talks, a brand new interview series for SFC Terrier TV. I'm your host, Sunny Faustino. You may know our first guest primarily as the chair of the Media and Communication Department, but she's also a filmmaker and scholar who has created award-winning films. Her latest film, The Blues Society, follows the Memphis Country Blues Festival from 1966 to 1969, and the legacy it has left behind. Please welcome Dr. Augusta Palmer. How are you, Dr. Palmer?
I'm very well, thanks, Sunny. How are you?
I'm good too. Thanks for being here. Before we talk about your film, let's give the viewers an idea of what it's about with the trailer. Take a look.
Memphis and this area has a rich musical heritage. This city has one of the richest histories of any music city in the world.
These men were geniuses. They were American heroes.
A great big hand for the Arcades.
Between that hash and my $65, we put on the first Memphis Country Blues Festival.
And people came from Europe, from all over the country.
Mick Jagger wants to talk to you on the telephone. The Goodyear blimp was coming overhead and PBS was filming.
Just before the festival, an Imperial Grand Wizard from the Ku Klux Klan held a rally.
One of my great uncles was actually killed by a white man. These things are very real to me.
We love this music and we went there to promote this music.
There is always a disconnect in the deep context of the music, which is violence and pain and hurt.
In 1969, it would be difficult to maintain that melancholia and the ability to express it musically is the exclusive property of the black man.
It's ours. It's ours. It's our legacy.
What would you say was the biggest inspiration for you to make this documentary about the festival?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it's my legacy because both my parents were involved in the festival. So I think that was one of the things that really made me want to get the story right because, you know, I'm the inheritor of what they did in many ways. So my dad wrote a lot about the blues. So, you know, that legacy is important to me, and of course, like as someone who's the daughter of someone who's known as a writer about a subject, mainly people come to me and say, wow, your dad was so nice. He came and covered my band when we were playing in a tiny bar and no one had to pay attention to us and he was writing for the New York Times and it changed our life. But I know that's not the only kind of story that there is about any writer, any critic, right? And I think it's really important when thinking about the blues to think about what it means to be the white daughter of a white writer writing about the blues, which is an art form that came from African Americans, was created by them under really difficult circumstances. So,
you mentioned your father, Robert Palmer, and he was a music critic during his time and appears in one of the subjects of one of your previous films. How would you say your relationship with music growing up shaped your artistic career as a whole?
Well, I didn't actually know my father growing up. I didn't meet him until I was 12 years old. So since he was a rock critic and I was becoming a teenager, that was pretty good timing in some ways. So that's all okay at this point. But I didn't grow up with him telling me about music that he liked. So I grew up with my mom who liked classical music and early music. So, but we did have one Rolling Stones record that I occasionally put on, often when she was out of the house because she didn't play very often. But and a record that my dad's band, the Insect Trust, had made in 1969 was also on the shelf, tucked in underneath the Beethoven. So.
How long have you been planning and working on this film, and what were some initial steps you took towards bringing this project to life? Were there any major challenges gathering the archival material or the interviews with the artists?
So there's a way in which I've been working on this film my whole life, since the 1969 Memphis Country Blues Festival which is the one that's most depicted in film footage. I was actually there in a certain way of speaking because my mom was pregnant with me. So there's a point in the film where she makes this kind of impassioned speech asking people to give money to support the blues musicians, and I don't remember it very clearly, but because I think she was about 4 months pregnant with me or something like that. I don't remember it at all. But so I like to be able to say that I've been working on this film my whole life. But in reality, I've been working on it in earnest since 2016. So like a lot of independent filmmaking, I think the hardest part is raising the money, and that just took a lot of time. But I was very fortunate to get support from St. Francis College in faculty development funds, and then to get support from the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities and the New York State Council on the Arts. So those things really made making the film possible. Obstacles about footage. At the very beginning, I was concerned because the only footage that I knew about was footage shot by Channel 13, the New York PBS station. Because that's one of the great things I think about the story is that it starts out in 1966 with a guy who has a $60 check and another guy who has a big ball of hash, and that's their financing for the first festival. And then 4 years after that, they have not one but two film and TV crews documenting the whole festival, and it was broadcast nationally with that Channel 13 footage. That said, it's great footage, but it's limited in some ways because the TV cameras were so big at that point. You know, they weren't mobile at all. And I knew that there was this 16 millimeter footage that I had been interested in earlier, but I didn't know if I was gonna have access to that. So when Fat Possum Records bought that footage and gave me access to it, that made the whole project a lot easier and a lot more exciting and fun. Yeah.
When producing the documentary, you also released a short film, Order My Steps, with playwright Kate Grant. How was the process of managing the two pieces? And what were some techniques you used to maintain your creative workflow?
It was challenging because especially at a certain point, my editor for both projects, Laura Jean Hocking, who lives in Memphis, was the same person. And so I think if I had to do it over again, even though I love working with Laura Jean, I would have had one editor for one project, one editor for the other, because it's just, you know, you can't work one editor overnight, all day and all night. No. So, but it really didn't become a huge issue. We were mainly able to work around and figure out things, and Order My Steps, of course, as a short and as a fiction film, just not nearly as many layers of things to choose from, and didn't have to get, you know, we licensed one piece of music for that film. The Blues Society has many pieces of music in it, so yeah.
Let's deep dive a little bit more on the film itself. St. Francis College notably promotes social justice as seen through many offerings and hosted campus events. Knowing that many students have taken interest in learning more about our nation's culture, history, how might the Blues Society help satisfy that curiosity?
Well, I think it is a film that from the beginning I really set out to make sure that I had a diverse group of people to call on in terms of experts. So Sandria Robinson, who's a sociologist who specializes in the blues at Georgetown University, and Jamie Hatley, who's a great writer. Now, when I started making the film, she was just a writer in print, and now she is also a writer for TV, right? I hope she's getting back to writing for P-Valley after the strike. Anyway, so they were really, you know, kind of guiding lights when I got an interview with them and got to talk with each of them to get their perspectives on the blues. Jamie, in particular, wrote a piece quite some time ago called Why I Hate the Blues. And that was like a really interesting perspective for me because I knew a lot of people who loved the blues. And Jamie actually, by now, loves the blues too. But it was about her kind of feeling of seeing the blues as like exoticized by white audiences and as something that was about poverty and suffering, and you know, that was familiar to her from growing up. She didn't feel that she wanted to necessarily be identified with that or to identify with it. And so that was really important to me. And then another person who was very important early on, who appears several times in the film, is a man named Henry Nelson, who I first met when he was managing community relations for the Stax Museum in Memphis, which is a great museum I recommend to everybody. And Henry, who's African American and grew up in West Memphis, which is just across the river from Memphis in Arkansas. He came to the Memphis Country Blues Festival in 1969 when he was, I think, 15 years old, because he was hoping he could find a ride to Woodstock. But he never got to Woodstock. I think that the Blues Festival ended up being his Woodstock, and he felt like he found his tribe, and he actually got very interested in the blues and got started interviewing and working with Furry Lewis and a lot of the musicians who are in the blues festivals and in the film. So he became a radio DJ and featured them quite a lot.
Did any specific artists or stories stand out to you or move you significantly while piecing the film together?
Yeah, I think the story that stands out to me the most at this point, although at different times I've been drawn to different stories, which is one great thing about working on a piece that has a lot of different characters in it. But at this point and more recently, I've been really interested in the story of Nathan Beauregard, who was this much older blues musician. And unlike a lot of the musicians in the film, he hadn't had a recording career. So several people in the film, Booker T. Washington White, Furry Lewis, Reverend Robert Wilkins, they had all had recording careers in the 20s, were stars of varying magnitude in race music or blues music. And but Nathan Beauregard had never had a recording career and was a blind man. And Bill Barth, who is one of the group of organizers of the festival and also a bandmate of my dad's in a band they had called the Insect Trust. Bill Barth was walking around a neighborhood in Memphis and canvassing for records, going around door to door and saying, "Do you have any old records? I'll give you some money for your old records," which is what a lot of 78 record collectors did then, like him. And he heard this music coming out of a house, and he thought, that's like incredible music. He was like, maybe it's somebody's old record, and he went to knock on the door, and someone said, "Come in," and he went in, and he saw Nathan Beauregard, who had been playing the music. It wasn't a record at all. And Bill Barth just kind of decided, here's this man who looked very old to him, who was playing this music that he knew was from a certain time period. So he made a kind of guess in his mind that this man must be like 100 years old. And it turns out that Nathan was only in his 70s. I know that, when you're 19 or 20, like everyone seems old to you. No, just like everyone seems young to me by now. But anyway, so even allowing for that though, a 20-year difference is pretty significant, or almost 30 years, right? So, but Nathan Beauregard, of course, having gotten the opportunity to play and make money for maybe one of the first times in his life. I don't know. Sadly, we don't have a lot of interviews with Nathan that would tell us that. I don't think he was in any position to say, sorry, you made a mistake on my birth date, when he was being billed as like the world's oldest living blues man. That was like exactly how they were sort of marketing him. I mean, I don't think they necessarily thought of it as marketing, but that's what it was. And so there was this, people really loved his music, and I think that love was really genuine, but yet there was, at the same time, I feel like this kind of projection going on to look at him as this like incredible figure who's 100 years old and still playing music. Some people are so lucky to do that. It is possible, but it wasn't the case here. And then what made me even more kind of saddened by this story is that when he died in 1971, he was buried in an unmarked grave. So it's not in the film at all, but one of the more satisfying things to me was I worked with this organization called the Mount Zion Memorial Fund that puts up funeral markers for bluesmen, and by doing that preserves a lot of African American cemeteries. And so we went in January and dedicated a grave to Nathan. So, you know, that story gets me in the feels, as they say.
That's beautiful. And my final question has to do with what is next after this film? Do you have any ideas in mind for your next feature, or do you plan on giving a little break between productions?
Definitely ready for a break. I'm thinking about, like, you know, just maybe going to hibernation for a couple of years. That said, I do have a couple of ideas that are bouncing around. One is that there's some of my favorite footage in the film right now is actually this footage that was shot by an experimental filmmaker in Memphis in the 60s. And some of the characters in the film appeared in his experimental films. So we get to see them as kind of something that gives you a flavor and a feeling of the times. Like if you see, there's like a scene where a woman is chasing after a VW bus, like banging on it with an umbrella. That's sort of like tells you what that footage is like, or you know, the zany, mainly black and white. I guess there's a little bit of color, mainly black and white footage of these Memphis beatniks, as they would describe themselves. So that was shot by a guy named Carl Orr. So there's a lot more of that, and I think it would be really fun to make a crazy experimental documentary befitting that crazy experimental footage. And Carl Orr himself, who I guess is in his 70s, is telling me he wants to learn nonlinear video editing on computers. So I don't know, maybe he's going to take the project away from me, and that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But that's one idea, and then I'm also developing an idea for a multi-part documentary about color, the science of color, the culture of color. What makes blue blue and red, and what has that meant over time? And how do we see it the way we see it in terms of scientifically, and then also in terms of culturally, right? So
that's interesting.
Yeah, and what I'm also thinking about, who would be the voice of blue or the voice of red? Yeah.
Very philosophical.
Yes.
Well, we want to thank you, Dr. Palmer, for taking some time to meet with us in our first edition of Terrier Talks. You can watch The Blues Society directed by Dr. Palmer very soon. For SFC Terrier TV, I'm Sunny Faustino, and we'll see you on the next one.